Reviewing iPhones is simple. Higher number is better, Pro is better, and we get special versions like the Mini and Plus phones. This phone, being the iPhone 13, is better than the 12, but lesser than the 14. But somehow, the iPhone 13 is actually the last best iPhone series, for traveling at least. Hello everyone, this is Matt from Real World Review, and I never reviewed the iPhone 13 because I didn't feel like there was a point. Now, let's talk about this normal, boring phone. And yes, this is a boring, basic phone. Not in the same way as an old iPhone or Samsung A14, but in the sense that there's nothing really happening with this phone. Of course, at an $800 launch price and a staggering $600 plus 2 years later, this phone doesn't really feel worth the money. For that price, you can find used iPhone 13 Pros, while the iPhone 14 Pros start at around $600, at least at the time of this recording. As someone that paid full price for the iPhone 14 Pro, I feel sad right now. But the 13 is still for those that want to walk into a store and buy a phone. Or at least that's what it feels like. You can buy this phone used, but that seems advanced for the people that would want to buy this phone in the first place. Honestly, I see the base iPhones as phones that are bought without checking out the reviews, which isn't so much of a bad thing. Okay, so I finished this review, but I wasn't really satisfied. Instead of scrapping the whole review, I'm adding this section in this area specifically because after all, this is my channel at its core. So let me be honest, this is a good phone. For me, 60Hz is a deal breaker, but other than that, this would be the phone that I would buy if the iPhone 13 Pro didn't exist. Or if it was like the iPhone 12 and 12 Pro differences. In the used market, this phone is perfect, being very similar to the iPhone 14, but way under that $400 used price point, actually putting this phone in mid-range territory for flagship level specs, even today. If you take anything from this video, it should be this. Look at the price of the phone. If it's in your budget, but the iPhone 13 Pro isn't, go for the iPhone 13. Even when comparing to the iPhone 15, there's very little differences outside of the USB-C port. While this phone is basic in my eyes, the specs do not follow that. We get the normal iPhone look that we're used to, though this was the second year in the style. A flat look with glass on the back that carries to the camera square with awkward camera holes, a microphone, and True Tone flash. The back is not unbreakable. The metal frame is a fairly durable aluminum with nothing on the top, while the right side is where the side button is for Siri and turning on the phone. The left side is where the mute switch is, something that the iPhone 15 Pro doesn't have, volume buttons, and a SIM tray. Another thing the iPhone 15 series and 14 series does not have, at least in the US. Yes, in the US this was the last iPhone series with a SIM tray, though 2022 was technically the absolute last with the iPhone SE. For those that will travel outside of the US to countries that don't support eSIM yet, this becomes a hot phone. Of course, outside of the US, all iPhones still have SIM trays, just not the US. Courage, again. Moving to the bottom is the microphone holes, speaker holes, which pairs with the earpiece for stereo sound, and the USB 2.0 lightning port. This allows for up to 20 watts of wired charging, which is not bad, but I don't really use that ancient port in the first place. I generally use wireless charging, which accepts 15 watts of MagSafe charging and 7.5 watts of normal wireless charging. That said, we're supposed to get Qi 2 capabilities as of iOS 17.2, which I have tested and seen it go to at least 12 watts. Then on the front of the phone, of course, we get that wonderful 6.1-inch 1170p screen, because Apple doesn't want 1080p or 1440p. This is of course an OLED panel that runs at 60Hz because it's not a Pro. It is a bright screen though, at 800 nits peak and 1200 nits for HDR content. I never had an issue with the brightness, and now it makes sense. There is a slightly smaller notch on this phone because the Face ID stuff is right in the middle while the earpiece loudspeaker is shoved to the top, something that lots of companies should have done years ago. As you can see, this is covered by a ceramic shield, which is also not unbreakable. And apparently scratches like metal? What's going on here? Moving into the phone, we get the Apple A15 chip, which is the same as the iPhone 13 Pro, just with 4 cores instead of 5 cores for the GPU. Yeah, little to no differences, but it does beg the question why the iPhone 13 and 13 Pro don't get the same processing tricks that the 14 gets if they have the same CPU. To power this phone, we get the 3227 mAh cell or 12.41 watt-hour battery that has okay battery life. The one I'm using has a battery health of 90% and lasts all day easily, but I never really thought that the normal numbered iPhones ever had crazy battery life. This is obviously a 5G phone with the ultra wideband support if you have this little antenna here. The phone is decently heavy at 174 grams, but it doesn't feel heavy to use. While I would say that this phone is IP68 dust and water resistant, I have seen many of these get wet, so take that claim as always with a grain of rice. As for the storage, 128 gigabytes is stock, while the options for 256 and 512 gigabytes exist, which may seem like a lot, and yes, that means that you can pay $900 for an iPhone 13 in 2024. I know I brushed over the processor because, well, it's awesome. Social media, processing apps, games, all run and look amazing on this phone and screen, just, at 60 Hz. And that's something I don't understand. Maybe it was the software or just a mental thing, but when the iPhone 13 Pro came out with a 120 Hz display, every super smooth iPhone just started feeling like it stutters and drops frames from doing basic stuff. Then again, games do look pretty smooth on here, so maybe it is just the software ruining every other phone. iPhones are like Samsung Galaxy S and Pixel phones. You gotta talk about the cameras. But at the same time, they're alright. It's the usual specs that we expect from an iPhone. All the cameras are 12 megapixel sensors with one on the front and two on the back. Only the main sensor is optically stabilized and focusable, while the ultra-wide and front camera are fixed focused and electronically stabilized sensors. If you're curious, my iPhone 13 mini review might explain the cameras a little bit better, but ultimately you get some really good shots that are A grade out of the main camera, and the ultra-wide is B to A grade depending on the situation. The front camera looks good and always produces some really good detail even though it can't focus. All the cameras are capable of 4K at 60 frames per second, which is always impressive to see, making this a pretty good and cheap camera for vlogging and documenting in general. Honestly, not much to say out of these cameras because it just works. There's no major gimmicks and there's nothing that feels half-baked, just some cameras that capture the image well and can record it even better. We even get the sensor shift stabilization that was previously only given to the iPhone 12 Pro Max and trickled down into the non-Pro phone. We also get HDR video in all video formats, again, something that was only on the 12 Pro and moved to the non-Pro 13. Cinematic mode was new on this phone, so obviously it wasn't a Pro feature and doesn't actually look good at 1080p 30 frames per second. Why not 24 frames per second when the normal video can do that? Plus, it'd be less processing. I believe that the iPhone 13 is actually worth the price. The iPhone 13 in the used market starts at around the $300 area, while the 14 is in the high 300s, so what do you get for that? You lose a SIM tray, courage. You get the same screen and almost the same cameras, which have slightly changed, allowing for the front camera to focus, 4K cinematic mode, and action mode, which, let's be honest, the camera modes could have gone to the iPhone 13 Pro and maybe the iPhone 13, but Apple was greedy. Like I said, the iPhone 14 has the 13 Pro A15 chip in there, as well as the emergency crash detection and satellite for SOS situations only. So does all that sound like it's worth the extra $100 retail or used? In the used market, the iPhone 13 is priced nicely for what you get. Some would even consider it to be kind of cheap. Compared to how well the iPhone 11 price was holding up a couple years ago, you actually get a good phone given the 50-ish% in depreciation it currently sells for, and 60+% compared to when it was launched. All this is good news for those considering this phone as their main device. Now, this phone is clearly not perfect. Actually, there seemed to be a time where the batteries on the 13 would expand and push up the screen. Maybe it was just a bad batch because I don't really see it happening too much anymore, or maybe my sample size is just too small to say if Apple fixed it or not. Seeing that this phone is similar to the iPhone 12, I can also believe that major damage to this phone can cause some catastrophic failures, like the baseband issues that I've seen on the iPhone 12 and Pro Max versions of, well, pretty much every Pro Max iPhone. By the way, the baseband does control the cellular data. Besides those issues, I am yet to see this phone be a terrible phone to own. There's no recalls and not really anything that needs to be recalled in the first place. Given the pricing and how long this phone should last, I don't see any issues buying this phone, even when you consider the iPhone 14 or 15 non-Pro models. This is running iOS 17 right now with the assumption that we will get at least iOS 21, whatever that looks like. And that's my review of the iPhone 13. The safe bet. But what do you think? Am I just not the demographic for this phone? And if I'm not, is that a bad thing? Hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for watching.